So I just want to thank everybody for making it to tonight's call. Just to give you kind of a breakdown of what we're going to cover tonight. Like I said, we're going to focus a little bit on nutrition. We're also going to go over the InBody printout. So hopefully all of you guys did your InBody assessment or are planning to do it in the near future. Again, if you haven't done it and you're not able to do it tomorrow morning, just get with me offline and we'll figure out days and times and stuff like that to make sure we can get that through.
Did you send out an email about scheduling that? I had trouble. Maybe your email got stuck in my junk mail as well.
I basically just said that we can do your assessments. There's an additional, because most of them were last week. There's an additional time for this morning and then tomorrow from 6 a.m. until noon at any of those three locations. So the Midland Community Center, the North End Fitness Center, and East End Dow facility.
Oh, okay. All right, fine. I'll go in the morning and do it. Thanks.
Awesome. Yep. And like I said, if one of those doesn't work, it's not a big deal. We'll just have to kind of figure it out schedule wise for a time that'll work for both of us. But so like I said, we'll go over that form that you should have received with that information and kind of give you some, like I said, I'm going to kind of do my paraphrasing of it, try and make it a little cleaner and simpler to understand. I'm also going to share with you guys after the call the link to the company's basic breakdown of it. So it'll tell you what each line item kind of means and that sort of thing. But like I said, we're also going to go over nutrition, diet type of things. Again, and we want to look at those strengths and weaknesses. That's going to be kind of a common trend just because your success is going to be so dependent upon kind of recognizing your own individual strengths and weaknesses and trying to set yourself up for success in those areas. The next thing is our meal prep or our snack prep, which I find to be equally as important. And then kind of when to eat, when's a good time to eat certain foods, bad time to eat certain foods. And then real briefly, just slightly touch on fasting. It's pretty exhausting category. So it's one of those things where if you guys have a lot of interest in it, if you kind of seek it out or questions after today's call, it's something that we can look at again in the future. And if not, we can kind of move on from there. All right, so hopefully you all can see pretty clearly the InBody analysis, the breakdown that you should have received or the form that you would have seen after completing your assessment. We'll kind of go through a little bit. The first line or the first kind of block of things is your body composition analysis. First line item is your total body water. So one of the things that this tool does that's kind of cool is it'll assess your body's water and not just kind of look at body fat as whole. And it gives us the ability to do the other form of the challenge, which is look at skeletal muscle mass, which is more important. Little side note, I'm actually kind of doing some research with you guys' assessments on your water, total body water, and that sort of thing. So thank you for the data that I'll get to use to kind of look at some of those things. So that's the main unique portion of the top section. The biggest portion that we're going to focus on is our muscle fat analysis. And so it's just a breakdown of our body weight, which is the top line item, this SMM, which is skeletal muscle mass, and then our body fat percentage. So these lines will also have kind of an area that is shaped, and that's basically saying what is ideal or what is close to ideal for your gender and height. And so they basically want you to be in an I formation, they call it, which basically means straight down in all three bars. The exception is if you have more skeletal muscle mass, it's not necessarily a negative, but you want to be in those ranges, especially with body fat mass, which is a different calculation of our body fat percentage. A lot of times we'll use the next line item, which is our obesity analysis. I absolutely love to talk about BMI because it's almost useless from an individual standpoint. So almost pays zero attention to that. I usually will share that it is kind of a useful tool at looking at large populations. So if you kind of look at it in the sense of, all right, let's look at the city of Midland and look at the total BMIs, that data there will kind of give us a fairly accurate representation of body composition and body health and that sort of thing. But our focus here is going to be that bottom number, that body fat, or that percentage body fat, which is the number that we're fixated on for half of the challenge. Like I said, the other half is that increase in skeletal muscle mass. So this just gives a breakdown. And then again, our ranges are going to be different from male to female as far as what's an acceptable range, but you want to be in that little dash area. From there is what they consider to be a good body fat percentage. The next one is the segmental lean mass, which is kind of an interesting, cool little statistic. There isn't a ton of value in it in my mind. It's not like I'm looking at that number and saying like, oh my gosh, I got to change how I do things, because my right arm is 4.17 pounds, as this says, in muscle or lean mass, and my left arm is only 3.99. It's much more useful to look at actual strength or movement based. So we're looking for mobility, we're looking for strength, and trying to correct asymmetries there, not necessarily looking for asymmetries from right to left in a muscle mass standpoint, unless you're an elite bodybuilder or something along those lines. The one thing that it can be helpful for is kind of identifying the bottom percentages. So I don't know exactly how they calculate it, but the percentage is saying that you're able to sustain the strength for 90.2% in your left arm to sustain your body weight. So based on your body weight, they're saying you should have X amount of muscle or lean mass in certain areas. And if you're at 100% or better, it basically is trying to indicate that you're capable of holding your own body weight, moving your own body weight in an efficient way. I don't know how, again, they come to these results, but it's an interesting statistic. Also can be a bit indicative of if you're a sedentary person, if you're an active person, that sort of thing. So if you see that your upper body is closer to 100% and your lower body is closer to 60%, kind of like this person is, it's 70%. You can recognize and say like, okay, we need to work more on lower body, just trying to get a general strength. And then the last thing that we always want to look at is this is helpful from our weight loss or from our basically any type of calorie calculation, is that basal metabolic rate right here on that right side of the screen. And that's just going to give you a calculation of how many calories that you need to sustain life. We kind of talked about it in the intro call, but that means just respiratory function, cardiovascular function, no movement, no exercise, no kind of anything, just digestion, no physical musculoskeletal movement from there. Any questions about that one? Okay. So next we're going to talk about nutrition, and I always have to give the caveat that I'm not a registered dietitian. And so I rarely will say, you need to do this or you need to do that. It's more along the lines of things that I've seen effective as a trainer or things that I practice on my own. One of the things that I find is the least controversial in the world of nutrition is the advice that I'm going to kind of pass along from here. So the biggest thing is having whole foods and the least amount of processing possible. So you have your lean proteins or just regular proteins without any additives or preservatives or anything along those lines, as well as vegetables. Again, no processing, no added preservatives or sugars or any of those things. Fruits, nuts and seeds, legumes or beans and peanuts and that sort of thing. Whole grains, not processed or even broken down, like white rice and that sort of thing. even brown rice and things like that are semi-processed. And so it's one of those things that I put it down towards the bottom of the list just because it's hard to find foods that are not somewhat processed in the grains to some degree. And then seasoning without added things like wheat or sugar or things like that. So most sauces tend to have sugars in them, and so that's something we're trying to avoid. But like I said, these are the things that are pretty non-controversial in the world of nutrition. The only exceptions are usually companies or people that are trying to sell you some sort of product that's packaged and helps their bottom line. So probably no questions there, but I'll ask if there is. The one thing I will say is that it can be absolutely difficult to eat in this manner. I found it to be myself. The real test is trying to go out to eat or trying to eat somewhere at a restaurant or someone else's house. You have very little control over ingredients and that sort of thing. But the next thing we'll have to talk about is our sugars. So again, along those same lines, we're looking for whole foods, just fruits and vegetables to get our natural sugars in. One of the things that I always find interesting is a lot of times people will say, well, isn't there sugar in, fruits and vegetables and that sort of thing? And the answer is absolutely yes. However, there's also tons of fiber. It's not nearly as difficult to process through the body, and it doesn't burn through quite as fast in a glycemic index. So I always tell people, just because there's sugar in an orange, I don't know anybody who's become obese from eating too many oranges. So keep that in mind and try and just eat those as much as you can or as often as you want to. The second category is kind of concentrated natural sugars. So like honeys, syrups, stuff like that, dried fruits. Most of those dried fruits often have added sugar to them as well. So they're not necessarily bad or as bad as processed sugars and syrups and stuff like that. But again, it is a pretty high calorie per energy and satiation rate. So it's something we want to kind of use minimally and try not to become too much of a habit. And then the last one is our artificial refined sugars and syrups. So even your cane sugars, your corn syrups, your aspartames, that sort of thing. Basically trying to avoid those as much as possible and trying to basically just do that as a balance. If you eat it, it's because, you went to someone else's house or you couldn't avoid it, or you just absolutely needed it, and then come back to our program. So next one I want to just kind of talk about is our strengths and our weaknesses. Again, this is going to just be kind of a theme, and I actually want you guys to kind of think about these and write these down. You don't have to share them unless you feel like you want to, or you find it helpful. I just jot down a couple of mine as far as the world of nutrition is. It's something that I struggle with, and I don't find it easy by any means, but a couple of my strengths are I love to eat fruit and love to have fruit around. I don't often overeat, so I'll usually kind of stop once I'm full. It's a difficult mentality for some people, but I often will think of food as fuel and not necessarily like, oh, I can't wait for my next meal type of thing. I do obviously like foods, but especially when I'm physically active, it's easier for me to kind of get into that mindset of I eat because I need fuel for A, B, or C. Another thing that I feel like I'm good at, usually if I'm kind of strict on what I'm trying to eat or what I'm trying not to eat, I'm usually pretty good at saying no and kind of avoiding those different foods. And somebody offers me pizza or beer or pop or something like that, I usually don't have too much of a difficult time saying, no, that's okay, I don't want it. I couldn't think of a fifth one. So if that makes you feel any better. A couple of my weaknesses or downfalls, I do tend to get a little hangry. And so when I get into that mode, it's pretty much anything that's in my path, doesn't matter, it'll get eaten. A little bit of contradiction to the say no, but we'll talk about why we avoid that in the first place. Also don't enjoy cooking. My wife has 2,000 cookbooks and likes to make different recipes. I do not. Make about 12 things and that's it. No variety whatsoever through those. So if I ever invite you over to dinner, she's cooking. I also am not a big fan of vegetables or greens, as we like to call them. I don't like broccoli, don't like green beans, don't like asparagus, don't like spinach. You name it, I probably don't like it. And I'll kind of talk about the little solution for that one in a second. I also, like a lot of people, tend to eat late. So after dinner, a couple of hours pass, kind of hankering for something to eat again. And then the last one is just peanut butter. If it's around, I tend to eat it. And a lot of times it goes with the other one as eating late. So we talked about last time about trying to double down on your strengths and minimize on your weaknesses. So a couple things that I try and do is for doubling down on my strengths to try and have a lot of fruit available, have a lot of fruit in the house and different options of fruits to eat throughout the day. The other one is kind of recognizing times when I would overeat. So if I'm going to indulge on something, just recognizing that and just being aware of it to avoid. Again, the more I kind of stay physically active, the more likely I am to not interpret food as a reward or anything along those lines. Think of it more as fuel. And then saying no is just, for me, is just kind of, it kind of builds as we go. And so not feeling like I can't put myself in a situation where I have to be restricted, because I know that that's not going to be an issue for me. So it's kind of like being around, people eating pizza or people eating different foods or going out to eat. So kind of knowing that that's a strength, I can kind of still do those social things without too much compromise. Avoiding those weaknesses. So eating anything when I'm hungry, obviously the solution is try to avoid being hungry. So it comes to our next one, which is always kind of focusing on snacks and having lots of fruits and lots of things to eat, so I don't get to that point. Not enjoy cooking. Solution there is marry someone who does. Also, having kind of those same snacks available, meal preps, that sort of thing, where you can cook multiple meals in one sitting. It minimizes your cooking time. Greens we'll talk about in the next one. Like I said, eats late. One of the little weird things that I came up with is just brushing your teeth like a half hour or so after dinner. I tend to not want to eat after I brush my teeth. And so that's a little habit trick to avoid kind of taking in calories after 8 o'clock or so. Peanut butter, I don't have a solution for. Just try and know that that's my weakness and try to eat something before I go to the peanut butter to minimize the amount of peanut butter that we eat. So hopefully you guys are able to kind of jot down your own and try and think up little ways to double down and avoid. So the next thing is our food prepare for success. This one is usually huge, especially for people that do have success with things like putting on muscle mass and losing body fat. Like I said, it's usually like I struggle with is once you get hungry, that willpower tends to start to drift and fade. And so having those meals and having everything kind of available and prepared just kind of makes life a little bit easier. Couple little things that I try and do is try to have at least 3 go-to options for each of your meals. And that kind of goes to my just interest in cooking. So finding recipes, finding dishes and things, or even just like things at the store that require less work. to be able to say, okay, if I'm in a pinch, I can eat this, or if I'm feeling like I'm starting to get hangry, I can eat this, and that'll kind of bring me back to the light side. The other thing that I like to do is try and just make an automatic meal, or at least a weekday meal. So like for breakfast, I'll just have a couple eggs, fruits, and some carrots, sometimes a smoothie or whatever. But having that in place just takes that thinking process out of it. So like a lot of people will work with a trainer, not because they necessarily need the trainer or feel like they need the trainer, but just because they don't want to have to think about their exercise, and they know they'll do better if that's already in place and kind of giving them the things to do without the process. The second thing is meal prep for the week, and we want to discuss what days you want to meal prep and for which meals you want to make a plan for. And this kind of goes back to those strengths and weaknesses, in the sense that if dinner is always the challenge, or if you find yourself on a certain meal eating more poorly or taking more poor choices, try to really focus on meal prepping for that specific meal, for that specific time, if it's a certain time of the week or the weekends or whatever. Again, just try and take out some of those question marks for that area. And then the obvious one is make a large portion so that you're able to spread those out throughout the week. So make a big thing on Sunday is the common one, and then you got dinner for the next 3 or 4 days. And then the last one is, again, kind of doing the same thing for snacks, because in between meals, a lot of times we're going to get hungry. We're going to feel that need to kind of snack on something or chew on something. And so having those things available, having things like fruits and nuts, clean bars, I call them. So like my favorite is Larabars, vegetables, just to have around so that you can kind of eat something in between meals, or fill that boredom if you're one of those people that kind of just tend to snack when you're bored. So making sure that those good foods are around, and some of those things that we don't want to eat quite as much of aren't readily available. I like to keep a couple in my car. Obviously, you don't want a banana sitting in your car for 6 or 7 days, but you get the idea. Something that's a little more packaged maybe for the car, and then just keeping stuff at home, maybe at work, that sort of thing. Any questions about meal prep? Okay. So not that you asked, but I thought I would share some of my favorite go-to snacks. Some of these things, like I said, will answer some of those other questions. So I don't work for Larabar, I don't get endorsed, but it's one of the few kind of meal bars or little snack bars or whatever that do consist of whole ingredients. It does have some dehydrated dates are usually the main source or one of the main ingredients for there. And so again, that's kind of in our yellow column, but these are those snacks and trying to avoid eating something that isn't as healthy. There are some Larabars that have chocolate, and so they have some refined sugar and that sort of thing. But if you look in the ingredients, which hopefully we're all getting better at, and trying to read through and making sure we're avoiding those words that we can't understand or pronounce, and focusing on those whole foods. Second one, mixed nuts, or just kind of any kind of nuts. Cashews obviously are, or most people know, are higher in fats, but it's a snack and we're trying to mix it in with other things. Lots of good omega-3 oils and stuff like that in our nuts as well. Dried mangoes, again, in our yellow category, it's a dried fruit. It's something that I usually will use as like something to eat while I'm exercising. So if I feel like I'm starting to get fatigued or blood sugar starting to go down a little bit, it's one of my favorite snacks. Basically, you can keep it on you. I mountain bike a lot, and so I would just keep it in a Ziploc bag in my pocket. It's kind of nice and chewy. Pull it out and it'll give you a little boost. Next is our vegetable smoothie. So this is one of those things where I was talking about not a fan of the greens. luckily, you can put them into a blender and mix them with some fruits and some water or some ice and have a little drink, and it doesn't taste quite like broccoli and spinach. So a great option for kids as well. But one of my favorite things to kind of make sure that I'm getting all those micronutrients, vitamins and minerals and stuff like that. Another ones are just raw carrots and hummus. It's probably my favorite vegetable is just raw carrots. Hummus is usually easy to find with just or to make with chickpeas and seasoning. Some of them will have preservatives in them, so you want to double check and look at those ingredients. And then just a fruit, clementines, those little cuties are the easiest way to go. Lots of good vitamins in there and fresh fruit. All right. I don't think anybody has questions about my snacks. So the last thing we're going to talk about is when to eat and fasting. So I'm going to give you my disclaimer. Fasting can be helpful when restricting calories, obviously, because you're not eating. But there are hundreds of different protocols, and people can respond differently to different protocols. It's recommended to seek medical clearance prior to beginning a fasting plan. So with that being said, everyone obviously fasts to some degree. The definition of breakfast is breaking your fast, right? And so sometimes it's a strategy to increase the number of hours that you're not eating. So a lot of times they'll do things like just skip breakfast or eat your breakfast later in the day or something like that. And you're reducing the number of hours that you're taking in nutrients and food. Like I said, there's a lot of different research behind it, and there's some kind of different reactions to it. Obviously, it can be super helpful. If it's something that you guys are interested in, we can take a little deeper dive into it. But there's all sorts of different kind of protocols, meaning that sometimes people will fast for longer one day and then not fast the next day. They'll do different hour blocks and that sort of thing. So it really is a whole rabbit hole that you can go down. Just know that it's one of those things where, like I said, if you reduce the number of hours that you're eating, you're less likely to consume as many calories for the day. Or occasionally there's some research saying that if you reduce the number of hours that you're eating, but you're doing those feedings or those eatings around physical activity, it can actually be beneficial. So that's pretty much where I'll leave it, unless anybody has questions regarding fasting that I'm capable of answering. Or you can share. Has anybody tried it? Has anybody done different fasting intervals or anything like that? Nope. Okay. So then the other thing is to talk about when should we eat or why should we eat and that sort of thing. So one of the biggest ones is going to make sure that you have fuel for your physical activity. So if, let's say, you've been fasting, you may have heard of fasted cardio before. In general, it's not a great idea, especially if it's a higher intensity. Usually early morning is the exception, right? So if you're first thing in the morning, you don't eat breakfast before you go for a run or something like that, it's usually not that big of a deal. But if you've been fasting for 18 hours and then you go and try and run sprints or do a CrossFit workout or something like that, a lot of times it's going to be bad, especially if it's your first time trying it or early on in that. So we want to make sure that we have proper nutrition going up to physical activity. The intensity of the activity is going to determine how much nourishment you need. In general, we want to have carbohydrates prior to eating. And again, there's a bit of a variance there as to how long before. Some people can eat 30 minutes before an exercise or an activity. Some people, it can be up to 2 hours before they feel like their stomach is kind of settled. Again, kind of depends on intensity, person, food, what you're actually eating. So a lot of times it's just trial and error and trying to see what will agree with you. But in general, you want some sort of carbohydrate prior to that. If you're going to eat something that's got a bit higher of a sugar content, it's better to do before or right after. The second one is don't eat before bed. We talked about that a little bit, but we want to go into that fasted state without especially a lot of high calorie things, high sugar, high fat, that sort of stuff. The next one, this is to contradict my smoothie a little bit, but don't drink your calories. And in general, that just means we don't want to be consuming calories that don't feel satisfying. We want something that's going to not make us feel hungry in the next 30 minutes. And so if you're taking in 250 calories, you want them to count. So pretty obvious there. Also, usually the calories in drinks are like juices and pops and things like that. Coffee may be the exception. But again, that has a spike on blood sugar. So we want to kind of minimize that as much as possible, or at least chase it with water. Don't overeat, pretty obvious. We'll talk more about portions and that sort of thing in a future call, but obviously we don't want to be consumed to the point where we feel lethargic, energy feels bad, but also it's generally not going to be energy that we can carry over. So it's better to kind of undereat and then go back and eat a little bit more than it is to overeat in the sitting. The next one is to boost our recovery. So we talked a little bit about protein on Sunday, and that's a big part of our recovery from our strength training, especially if our goal is more adding skeletal muscle mass. So we want to make sure, generally stay within 30 minutes of completing your training to consume at least 10 grams of protein or so. Kind of depends on the person, but rough estimate. And if your training is a bit more intense, meaning more heart rate, respiratory rate elevated than just kind of a weightlifting session, you also want to mix it with some carbohydrates to help our recovery for energy in the next day or the next physical activity. The other thing is to kind of spread out that protein. So every time we kind of eat something, general rule, good rule to have to meet that protein requirement is to get protein with each feeding. So every time we kind of eat, we want a little something with some protein, just to keep it consistent and keep us going. All right. Any questions about those? All right. So a couple key takeaways. We want to focus on eating whole foods. We also want to avoid eating added sugars and syrups. We want to make eating well easier for you. Comes back to our strengths and weaknesses. We want to make eating poorly harder to do. So avoid having that stuff around and putting yourself in bad situations. And lastly, we want to try and be conscious about what and when to eat. All right. Just the last little bit, any questions for me or any comments on things that you guys tried over the last couple of days, meaning your food logs or your strengths and weaknesses?
James, I have a question.
Yeah.
How do you, to start thinking about making meals with whole foods when you're used to having things like mac and cheese, lasagna, pizza, things clearly that aren't on your list.
Yeah.
I've struggled with how to get started. Some example meals. The snacks were great, but
Yeah. So basically there's a ton of resources out there, and I can share some of like my favorite recipes and stuff via email. I obviously don't have them with me right now, but for instance, like I said, my automatic breakfast is I'll have a few eggs, a piece of fruit, and then I usually will have like carrots or some nuts or something to snack on. For dinners and things like that, it gets a little more difficult just because there's so many different tastes. But it's easier if you base it around a protein of some sort. So obviously those starches and those carbs and things like that usually come more in the form of things like, a lot of times people go to brown rice, sweet potatoes, potatoes, that sort of thing, quinoa, couscous. But if those aren't, one of the things that we tend to do at my house is kind of follow what's called Whole30 recipes. And so a lot of times they'll have substitutes for things like flour with like a cassava flour or an almond flour, which is just to avoid a gluten, but not necessarily exponentially healthier. So I would say focus on your protein and making your chicken, beef, fish dishes and that sort of thing. If you have things that you guys are looking for, or proteins that you enjoy, like I said, I can try and share some of the recipes that I've used before.
I'll do some Googling, that helps.
Okay.
But what about a little bit of bread? What about, a half a slice of bread with butter? That's really a bad idea.
Yeah, I mean, so it's one of those things where your plan is going to be your plan, and so the best system for you is going to be the system that you can stick to, and the best case scenario for you. So if I'm comfortable going without bread and butter, and you're not, that's okay. It's not like I'm not going to sit here and say that I follow all of my rules perfectly, or adhere to a paleo diet or anything crazy like that. We do what we do, right? And we just want to kind of, like I said, double down on those things that we're good at and trying to align with those principles as best as we can, and then try and minimize some of those other ones. So for example, if 2 out of your 3 meals follow those suggestions, you know what I mean? You're already 2/3 better than we probably were before. And so it's always going to be about progress and kind of finding your journey, because it does take quite a bit of time. And that's why a lot of times you see like people kind of success and fail a little bit, because it is a bit of trial and error to see what's going to stick for you, what meals you're going to like. Like some people will replace pop with like carbonated water or whatever, and like sometimes that'll scratch the itch, and sometimes you'll be like, this is crap, this isn't this isn't pop, this isn't what I want. And so it's kind of trying to figure out what works best for you and what doesn't. The one thing that I did want to mention before I go is, the one thing that like always gets me about nutrition, and we talk about like, oh, this is healthy and this isn't healthy and this is healthy. I always like to kind of give the analogy that the human species has been around for, well, let's say at the bare minimum, 8,000 years, 10,000 years, whatever it is. And at the maximum, maybe, 500,000 years or something like that. Up until the last 250 years, the Industrial Revolution, our food basically came from food. You know what I mean? Our food was basically whole foods. So for the entirety of our species, up until the last, 0.5%, it's been that way. And so now, as things change and things become much more efficient, and there's way more food than there ever was, and it's more accessible and it's easier to eat. And I mean, you can eat, avocados and kiwis and fruits in 2-degree weather in Michigan. But you know what I'm saying? Like the change in what's the norm and what we kind of eat on a mealy basis is pretty transformative, quite an evolution, or de-evolution, if you want to call it that.
That's good perspective. Thanks.
Awesome. Any other questions, comments, concerns, complaints? Yeah, chat. You have a suggestion about macros if I follow the 0.71 gram per protein. My protein intake is very high and there isn't much room for a balanced diet. Yeah, so there's quite a bit of ranges as far as macros are concerned. So macros are breaking down your calories into carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. In general, you want to have, they say, roughly 35% of your calories from protein, 35% of your calories from fats or lower, and then the remaining 30 to 40% of calories from carbohydrates. Now, depending on what your goal is, those percentages might change a little bit. And so, like I mentioned on Sunday, that is a high requirement for that protein intake. So 0.75 to 1 gram of protein. And so that high of a protein is going to still be great for losing weight, but it's not quite as essential if we're trying to put on muscle mass. If we're trying to put on muscle mass, it's going to be quite a bit more significant. Obviously, our priority in losing the body fat percentage or losing weight is to have that negative caloric intake. And so that's going to trump that protein, but at the same time, we still want to get as much protein as we can, or as close to that 0.7 as we can, to minimize the loss of muscle mass. Because if you just have a big caloric deficit and we're not getting enough protein, it's more likely that you're going to lose both a combination of fat and muscle. Does that make sense? Yep. Cool. All right. Anything else? Well, feel free to email me. Like I said, if you haven't done your InBody, try and get in to do that tomorrow morning. And hope today was helpful.
Yeah, this was really good. Thanks, James.
Thank you guys. Have a great night. We'll see you next week.
Bye.
Bye-bye.